The night was quiet, the kind of stillness that made every creak of the farmhouse sound like a thunderclap. Hank Redding stretched his legs on the old leather recliner, savoring the last sip of his evening coffee, while Martha flipped through a dog-eared cookbook at the kitchen table. Their evenings were always predictable, a rhythm of chores, meals, and conversations about tomorrow's tasks. But tonight, the peace was shattered by a sound they hadn't heard in years. Buddy's frantic barking, the dog's deep guttural barks echoed from the barn, piercing the cool night air. Hank furrowed his brow, setting his coffee cup on the side table. Buddy was protective, sure, but this was different. He wasn't just barking to scare off a stray coyote or raccoon. There was an urgency, a desperation in his voice that set Hank on edge. "Something's got him riled up," Hank muttered, grabbing his flashlight. Martha glanced up, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Maybe it's nothing. You know how he gets sometimes." Buddy, a muscular German shepherd with a thick coat of sable and tan, was pacing back and forth, his nails scraping against the dirt. "What's got into you, boy?" Hank asked, his voice low but firm. Buddy didn't stop. Instead, he turned to Hank, his eyes wide and pleading, before barking again at the barn door. Hank hesitated. The barn hadn't been used in years, not since they'd moved most of the equipment to the newer shed. It was locked up tight, a relic of days gone by. But Buddy's behavior was unnerving. The dog wasn't just agitated, he was insistent, as if trying to communicate something beyond Hank's understanding. All right, Hank muttered, reaching out to pat Buddy's head. "We'll take a look in the morning." Back in the house, Hank relayed the encounter to Martha, who listened with a mix of skepticism and concern. "Maybe you should check it now," she said after a moment. "What if it's something serious, an animal trapped in there or worse?" The dog spent the entire night on the porch, whining and scratching at the door whenever Hank or Martha stirred. By dawn, Hank was bleary-eyed and irritated, but he couldn't ignore Buddy's persistence any longer. Armed with a crowbar, Hank trudged back to the barn, Buddy trotting at his heels. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the field. The old padlock was stubborn, but a few firm pulls broke it loose. As the barn doors creaked open, Buddy darted inside, his nose to the ground. The air inside was stale, thick with the smell of dust and old hay. Hank's flashlight swept across the room, illuminating stacks of forgotten tools and piles of lumber. For a moment, it seemed like nothing was out of the ordinary, but then a faint sound reached his ears, a muffled rustling followed by a low groan. "Who's there?" Hank called out, his voice echoing in the empty space. Buddy barked sharply, leading Hank to a corner of the barn where a tattered tarp was draped over a pile of hay. With a sense of dread creeping up his spine, Hank pulled the tarp aside, revealing a young man curled up beneath it. The boy, no older than 20, was pale and trembling, clutching a small, battered duffel bag to his chest. His clothes were dirty and torn, and a dark stain on his jeans hinted at an injury. "Help," the boy whispered, his voice barely audible. "Please." Buddy stood between them, his ears pricked and body alert, ready to protect if necessary. "You're safe here," Hank said, keeping his voice low and steady. "But you've got to tell me what's going on. Who are you? Why are you in my barn?" The boy hesitated, then nodded weakly. Hank reached out a hand, but Buddy was quicker. The dog nudged the boy gently, offering silent encouragement. To Hank's surprise, the boy smiled faintly and placed a shaky hand on Buddy's head. "Tyler," he croaked, his voice hoarse. "My name's Tyler. He needs help." Inside the farmhouse, Martha bustled around, gathering supplies, while Tyler sank into a kitchen chair. Hank noticed how his grip on the duffel bag never wavered, his knuckles white with strain. "Let's take a look at that leg," Martha said gently, kneeling beside him with the first aid kit. Tyler flinched, but didn't resist as she rolled up his torn jeans, revealing a deep gash oozing dried blood. "What happened?" Hank asked, his tone firmer now. "That's not just a scrape from a fall." There was nothing unusual, just the quiet expanse of their fields, but Buddy's instincts were rarely wrong. "Someone out there?" Martha asked, her voice tinged with worry. "Not sure," Hank replied, grabbing his shotgun from the corner. He opened the door and stepped onto the porch, Buddy at his heels. The dog's growl deepened as he sniffed the air, his body rigid with tension. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, faintly, Hank heard the distant hum of an engine. A black truck was parked near the edge of their property, its occupants obscured by tinted windows. "Stay inside," Hank called over his shoulder. He watched the truck carefully, his pulse quickening. After a few moments, the engine roared to life, and the vehicle sped away, kicking up a trail of dust. Buddy barked once, sharp and urgent, as if to warn Hank not to let his guard down. Back inside, Tyler looked like he'd seen a ghost. His face was pale, and his hands trembled as he clutched the bag even tighter. "Who were they?" Hank demanded. "Are they the ones you're running from?" "But now that he's here, we've got to figure out what to do." Whoever they were, they wouldn't give up easily. And now his family was caught in the crossfire. Buddy let out a soft bark, breaking the tension. The dog's gaze was steady, almost reassuring, as if to say, "We've got this." "All right," Hank said at last. "You can stay here for now, but if you're putting my family in danger, we're going to have a serious problem." Hank stood on the front porch, his coffee cooling in his hands, his eyes scanning the horizon. Tyler sat quietly at the kitchen table, picking at the breakfast Martha had set before him. The tension in the air was palpable, as if everyone was waiting for the next shoe to drop. Buddy was the only one who seemed unaffected, pacing the perimeter of the house, his nose to the ground. His vigilance was both reassuring and unnerving. Hank couldn't help but wonder if the dogs sensed something they couldn't. "Someone's going to come looking," Hank said, breaking the silence. He set his mug down and leaned against the counter. "That truck yesterday wasn't just passing through. You've got to give us more than that, kid. Who are they? What kind of trouble are we dealing with here?" "You did the right thing. But first, we need to make sure this place is secure." Hank grabbed his binoculars and focused in, but before he could make out any details, the figure turned and disappeared into the woods. "Someone's out there," Hank said, his voice low as he re-entered the house. Martha frowned, setting down the dish she was washing. "Are you sure?" Hank followed, his heart pounding. The barn door hung open, swaying in the wind, but there was no sign of anyone inside. Buddy sniffed the ground, his nose leading him to a pile of overturned crates. Hank approached cautiously, his flashlight cutting through the shadows. Nothing. Whoever had been there was gone. Back at the house, Tyler was visibly shaken. "They're testing us," he said, "seeing how close they can get before we react. Next time, they won't get off so easy." Just days ago, their biggest concern was whether the tractor needed repairs. Now, they were caught in a web of danger and uncertainty, all because of the boy sleeping fitfully on their couch and the dog who had brought him to their doorstep. Toward dawn, Buddy began to grow restless, whining softly and pawing at the door. Hank stood, gripping his shotgun tighter. "What is it, boy?" Hank followed, his pulse quickening. Outside, the faint glow of headlights cut through the darkness. A black truck idled at the far edge of the property, its engine rumbling softly. "They're back," Hank muttered, "and this time, they're not just watching." Buddy was at his side, his ears pricked and his body tense, ready to act. The rumble of the engine was the only sound, a low, menacing growl that sent a chill down Hank's spine. "Are they coming closer?" Martha's voice crackled through the walkie-talkie she clutched inside the house. She and Tyler were locked inside, watching from the windows. "Not yet," Hank replied, "but they're not leaving either." He was ready to defend his home, but the uncertainty of the situation gnawed at him. What did they want? Were they here for Tyler, or were they here to send a message? As the sun rose higher, the truck finally backed up, its tires crunching against the gravel before it disappeared down the road. But Hank knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Back in the house, Tyler sat at the kitchen table, his head in his hands. Buddy sat beside him, nudging his arm with a wet nose. Tyler looked up, a faint smile crossing his lips as he scratched the dog's head. "He likes you," Martha observed, setting a plate of toast in front of Tyler. "That's not something he does with just anyone." And people who didn't look like they wanted to be there. Enough to put them away for a long time. But they found out before I could get it to the authorities. I barely made it out alive." He stood at the window, his tail wagging faintly as he stared out at the field. Hank followed his gaze and saw nothing unusual, just the empty stretch of farmland. "Buddy doesn't miss much," Hank said. "If he's watching, there's something out there." The dog had come to them 3 years ago, found wandering the edge of their property with a deep gash on his side and a collar with no tags. He had been wary at first, flinching at every sudden movement, but Martha's gentle care and Hank's quiet patience had earned his trust. Buddy had repaid that trust 100 times over. He was more than a pet. He was a protector, a constant reminder that even broken things could find a place to belong. Watching him now, sitting beside Tyler with his head resting on the boy's knee, Hank felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name. Hope, maybe, or understanding. "You're lucky he found you," Hank said to Tyler, nodding toward Buddy. "He's got a knack for showing up when he's needed most." He grabbed his shotgun and moved quietly to the front window, where the dog stood, his body tense. Outside, the black truck was back, its headlights off, but its presence unmistakable. "They're testing us," Hank muttered, "seeing if we're still on guard." He boarded up the windows on the lower floor and double-checked the locks on every door. Martha kept watch from the kitchen, a rifle propped against the counter within arm's reach. Tyler helped where he could, but his nervous glances toward the horizon betrayed his unease. Buddy stayed close to Hank's side, his sharp eyes scanning every shadow. His growls were soft but constant, as if even he felt the storm brewing. By mid-afternoon, the farm was as fortified as it could be. Hank stood on the porch, his shotgun slung over his shoulder, surveying the property. The fields stretched out in every direction, offering little cover for anyone approaching. It was both a blessing and a curse. A clear line of sight, but no way to hide. "They'll come back," Hank muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "They always do," Tyler said quietly from behind him. His voice carried the weight of experience, and Hank glanced back at the boy, seeing the fear etched in his features. "You've been through this before, haven't you?" Hank asked. Tyler nodded, his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets. "When I first ran, they caught up to me at a motel outside Louisville. Barely made it out that time. I don't think I'll be so lucky again. You're not facing this alone." One of them carried a pistol, the other a crowbar. Neither looked interested in conversation. Hank stepped forward, shotgun in hand, with Buddy at his side. Martha stood in the doorway behind him, her rifle ready. Tyler stayed just inside, peeking out from the window. "You're trespassing," Hank called out, his voice firm. "I suggest you turn around and leave before this gets ugly. Hand over the boy and the bag and we'll be on our way." The men hesitated, glancing at the dog. Even armed, they seemed unwilling to test Buddy's resolve. "You want the boy?" Hank said. "You'll have to go through us first." Martha fired from the doorway, hitting one of the men circling the house. Tyler, frozen at first, finally grabbed the duffel bag and sprinted for cover behind the couch. The remaining attacker made a break for the house, but Buddy intercepted him, tackling him to the ground. Hank stepped in, pressing the barrel of the shotgun to the man's chest. "Call them off!" Hank demanded. The man glared up at him but hesitated. Hank pushed harder, his voice sharp. "I said call them off!" The man spat, raising his hands. "Stand down!" The dog's coat was matted with dirt, but his tail wagged slightly as he trotted back to Hank's side. "You did good, boy," Hank said, kneeling to scratch behind Buddy's ears. The dog leaned into his hand, his eyes bright with satisfaction. Inside, Tyler slumped against the wall, clutching the duffel bag to his chest. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice trembling. "I didn't want any of this to happen." The following morning, the air felt heavier than usual, the kind of stillness that signaled an impending storm. Hank stood by the kitchen window, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Tyler sat across from him, his fingers nervously tapping the edge of the duffel bag. Martha busied herself at the stove, but her movements were mechanical, her mind elsewhere. Buddy sat near the door, his ears pricked and his body tense, as if anticipating what was to come. "They'll be back," Hank said finally, breaking the silence. His voice carried the weight of certainty. And this time they won't be testing us. They'll be coming for blood. If we keep waiting for them to strike, we're just giving them the upper hand. It's time we end this. They're not going to let us walk out of here without a fight. Hank used his old CB radio to contact a friend in the sheriff's office, a man he trusted with his life. We've got something big, he said, but we need backup. As night fell, the tension grew thick enough to cut with a knife. The farmhouse was dark, save for the faint glow of a lantern in the kitchen. Hank stood by the front door, his shotgun resting against his shoulder. Buddy lay at his feet, his ears twitching at every sound. "They're coming," Hank said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. The first sign of trouble came just after midnight. The sound of engines echoed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Hank peered out the window and saw the headlights of multiple vehicles approaching the farm. "Here we go," he muttered, gripping his shotgun. The truck stopped just outside the property line, and several men climbed out, their silhouettes dark and menacing. One of them called out, his voice carrying over the distance, "We know you're in there. Hand over the boy and the bag, and no one gets hurt." Buddy followed, standing at his side like a sentry. "This is your last warning," the man shouted. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." Buddy charged into the fray, his powerful body slamming into one of the men attempting to breach the back door. The man cried out as Buddy's teeth found their mark, and he stumbled away, clutching his arm. Tyler stayed low, clutching the duffel bag as he crawled to the kitchen. He knew he wasn't a fighter, but he wasn't going to let fear paralyze him. His job was to protect the evidence, and Buddy had made it clear he wasn't going to let anything happen to him. The fight raged on for what felt like hours, but Hank and Martha held their ground. Just when it seemed like the attackers were gaining the upper hand, the wail of sirens pierced the air. Red and blue lights lit up the night as sheriff's vehicles roared onto the property. The attackers scattered, some fleeing into the woods, others attempting to reach their trucks. The deputies were quick, apprehending several of the men before they could escape. Hank lowered his shotgun, his chest heaving as the adrenaline began to wear off. Buddy trotted back to his side, his coat matted with dirt, but his tail wagging triumphantly. "We did it," Tyler said, his voice trembling with relief. "We actually did it." The operation was over, and the network of criminals was about to crumble. Tyler stood on the porch, watching as the last of the trucks disappeared down the road. "You can stay here as long as you need," Martha said, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. Tyler shook his head. "Thank you, but it's time I move on. I've got people to help now, and I can't do that hiding out here." They had faced the storm and come out stronger for it.